Sometime in early 2025, a mid-tier Chinese wafer fab quietly disappeared, not from a sanctions list, not from a trade restriction, but from a merger notice filed in Beijing. By mid-year, more than 10 such deals had been announced. The force thinning China's chip industry did not come from the Commerce Department's entity list. It came from Zhongnanhai. One chain, 5 rungs, and a restructuring that has no equivalent in any market economy. The United States export regime was designed to starve China's semiconductor sector into fragmentation. Instead, it handed Beijing the political cover to do what command economies almost never accomplish cleanly: deliberately eliminate their own weakest players before the market does, concentrating capability at exactly the nodes where survival is possible. The restriction did not fracture the chain. It told Beijing which links to weld shut. Watch where Semiconductor Manufacturing International sits throughout what follows, because that company is the gravitational center of everything Beijing is now engineering, and where it ends up tells you whether this whole structure produces real capability or just tidier paperwork. Here's how those 5 rungs connect, cause to effect, each graded for how solid the ground is. The first rung is confirmed. For years, provincial governments across China subsidized the construction of wafer fabrication plants with a generosity that had nothing to do with demand. The result, visible in industry capacity tracking and acknowledged in Chinese state media economic coverage by 2024, was severe overcapacity at mature process nodes, meaning 28 nanometer technology and older. Dozens of foundries were competing on the same low-margin products, undercutting each other's prices and running at utilization rates that made continued independent operation commercially indefensible. Specific utilization figures vary by analyst and should be treated as estimates rather than hard data, but the directional picture is not in dispute. The overcapacity was real, the economics were punishing, and the precondition for forced consolidation was already in place before Washington tightened a single additional control. That matters for what comes next. The second rung is reported, and this is where the causal story turns in a direction most coverage has missed. United States export controls on advanced chip-making equipment, initially targeting tooling for nodes below 14 nanometers and then broadened in successive rounds, made it economically irrational for marginal Chinese foundries to attempt an independent path toward advanced manufacturing. The capital expenditure required could not be sourced from Western suppliers. The return horizon was undefined. So the smaller fabs that had been quietly planning advanced node build-outs abandoned those roadmaps, which left them as pure mature node players with no differentiation story and no path to justify the investment they had already made. That profile, a company with assets but no forward trajectory, is exactly what Beijing's consolidation framework targets for absorption rather than survival. The trade press and analyst community have reported this chilling effect on second-tier fab strategy. Direct causal attribution to specific firms' decisions is inferred from circumstantial evidence rather than company disclosure, so grade this link as reported, not confirmed. Now hold the logic of that rung. The controls were designed to prevent Chinese capability from advancing. They did suppress advancement at the smaller marginal players, but suppressing advancement at the margins is not the same as suppressing advancement overall. The entity meant to be weakened by attrition handed the restructuring case to its adversaries' planners. The pressure that was supposed to produce fragmentation produced instead the political conditions for concentration, because once the weaker players had no credible path forward, Beijing had a legitimate economic rationale to absorb them into the stronger ones. That rationale had always existed in the data. The controls made it undeniable. The third rung is confirmed, and it is the spine of this chain. Beijing read the same utilization data, it watched the same strategic retreat by second-tier fabs, and it responded not by waiting for the market to sort things out, but by announcing a deliberate restructuring framework, reported publicly as a 3+2 regional model. Under that framework, Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen are designated as the surviving poles for logic manufacturing. Wuhan and Hefei are the concentration zones for memory. The policy language explicitly targets the elimination of, in translation, poorly planned ventures. More than 10 merger, absorption, or wind-down deals involving Semiconductor Manufacturing International, Huahong, and a range of smaller foundries were announced in 2025 alone. The deal count and the geographic framework are on the public record, documented in Chinese industry policy documents and tracked in semiconductor industry reporting. The internal deliberation behind the framework is not publicly documented, but the outputs are visible. This is the deliberate Command Economy Act that has no Western equivalent, the state acting as the architect of which entities survive, rather than waiting for market selection to do the work. This is also where the single decision the whole chain hangs on becomes concrete. It is not the merger count. It is whether Beijing can actually enforce exit on state-owned enterprises that are, by political design, extremely difficult to eliminate. Several of the fabs targeted for absorption or wind down are state-owned enterprises with balance sheets, employment commitments, and provincial political patrons attached to their survival. The merger announcements are confirmed. Whether the actual asset transfers, workforce reductions, and process consolidations follow on a usable timeline is reported at best, and in many cases simply not yet evidenced. A deal filing and an operational merger are not the same thing in any economy. In China's state-owned enterprise structure, the gap between the two has historically been substantial. If the exit mechanism stalls, the 3+2 map remains a planning document. The fourth rung is reported, and it is the most analytically underrated feature of the plan. The geographic allocation is not administrative tidiness. It is a deliberate bet that memory and logic face different sanctions trajectories and therefore need different survival strategies. Logic foundries in the coastal clusters, meaning the Beijing, Shanghai, and Shenzhen poles, sit proximate to China's advanced packaging ecosystems, to domestic design software tool access, and to the domestic fabless chip design companies that are Semiconductor Manufacturing International's primary customers. Memory concentration in Wuhan and Hefei is not arbitrary either. Wuhan is home to the Yangtze Memory Technologies Complex, and the state-backed investment in non-flash manufacturing in that region predates the current consolidation by several years. That footprint is documented. What is analyst-level inference rather than stated government rationale is the idea that Beijing's allocation reflects a deliberate bet on diverging sanctions trajectories, with logic needing proximity to design ecosystems and memory needing proximity to the specific capital and process knowledge already embedded in inland clusters. The inference is coherent. Whether it reflects actual strategic intent inside Beijing's planning process is reported, not confirmed. That geographic bet may be right. The logic and memory stacks face genuinely different technology landscapes. Memory at advanced nodes, particularly non-flash, involves stacking layers in ways that are more amenable to domestically sourced tooling at current maturity levels. Logic at advanced nodes remains more dependent on equipment categories where export controls bite hardest. Separating the two and giving each a distinct regional home with distinct capital allocation and distinct equipment qualification priorities is a structurally rational response to that asymmetry. Whether the two stacks actually perform as intended is not yet testable, but the reasoning behind the separation is the most consequential and least discussed feature of the plan. The fifth rung is inferred, and it is where the whole chain either validates or stalls. If the consolidation succeeds in concentrating process research and development, tooling, procurement leverage, and engineering talent inside a smaller number of better capitalized entities, those entities approach the capital allocation thresholds at which domestically sourced equipment becomes economically viable to qualify rather than a workaround of last resort. Chinese domestic equipment makers, including companies working on etch tools, deposition systems, and domestic lithography, have made documented progress at mature nodes. Their position at more advanced nodes is measured in reported roadmaps rather than shipped production volume. The mechanism connecting consolidation to equipment qualification progress is analytically coherent. Fewer, larger fabs create larger and more credible qualification pipelines for domestic tools, which in turn reduces the ceiling that export controls can impose on Chinese process capability. Think of it this way. A single restaurant group ordering kitchen equipment from a startup supplier carries more weight than 100 independent diners each buying one unit. The supplier will staff an application engineer for the group. It will take years to return that call from the independents. Semiconductor Manufacturing International absorbing 5 marginal foundries does not just rationalize capacity, it becomes the kind of customer that forces a domestic equipment maker to actually qualify its tool against a real production line, with real yield targets, on a real schedule. That is the mechanism. Whether it produces measurable node advancement in a 3 to 5 year window is not yet evidenced. The chain's softest point is also its most politically sensitive. The state-owned enterprise exit problem runs through the third and fourth rungs and determines whether the consolidation is real or cosmetic. Merger filings are not operational mergers. In China's institutional environment, announced restructuring and completed restructuring have not historically moved on the same timeline, and the firms being asked to approve their own elimination carry political weight that does not dissolve on a policy directive. The deal pipeline is confirmed. The execution is reported at best. The second soft point sits at the top. The claim that consolidation will produce equipment qualification progress rests on the assumption that domestic tooling is actually close enough to production-viable specifications that a better capitalized customer can pull it across the line. That assumption is reasonable. It is not confirmed. Progress at mature nodes is documented. Progress at the advanced nodes, the 3+2 plan, ultimately needs to serve as a roadmap claim, not a shipping volume claim. The third soft point is the geographic bet itself. The logic and memory split only makes strategic sense if the two stacks genuinely face different sanctions trajectories going forward. If controls broaden further to cover mature node equipment or advanced packaging, which has been discussed but had not been implemented, as of mid-2025, the coastal logic clusters lose their assumed breathing room and the model's internal logic changes. The liquidation phase of this chain is confirmed and moving. The capability phase, the part where the surviving entities actually outperform the sum of what they absorbed, is inferred. The chain does not yet earn that conclusion. Here is the reporter's plain account of what has actually happened. Beijing has engineered a shakeout that Western trade policy did not anticipate, because Western trade policy was designed against a different kind of adversary, one that would respond to pressure by slowing down rather than by rationalizing. The restriction arrived. The fragmentation it was supposed to produce arrived too, briefly, in the form of marginal fabs with no forward trajectory. Then the fragmentation became the pretext for the consolidation Beijing had wanted all along but could not politically justify without it. The weakest players had to look commercially indefensible before the directive to absorb them could be issued without triggering the kind of internal resistance that state-owned enterprise restructuring normally generates. Washington's controls made them look indefensible. Beijing moved. The surviving foundries, with Semiconductor Manufacturing International as the gravitational center, are better positioned than the field they replaced. They hold more capital, more engineering depth, and more procurement leverage. Whether they are positioned well enough to matter at advanced nodes is the question the next 2 or 3 equipment qualification cycles will answer. Not this one. The chain is not complete. The top rung is still inferred. The shakeout Beijing needed, it could not order, so it waited for Washington to order it first. Watch Semiconductor Manufacturing International's disclosed node roadmap and Huahong's post-merger capital allocation over the next 12 to 18 months. If the surviving entities begin qualifying domestic tooling at process nodes they previously sourced externally, the chain holds. If the equipment qualification gap persists despite consolidation, the top rung does not close, and the 3+2 model produces a tidier map without producing a stronger one. That is the next observable event in this sequence. If you track where this lands, subscribe and turn on notifications. We follow the next link when the data earns it.